great of you all to come. Thank you very much. The subject really is a few months on looking at the Asian Century White Paper, which started with a lot of promotion and public hope, and now a sense of disillusion seems to be creeping in right across the country. And also the strategic white paper that the Prime Minister came up with during the holiday period, where she said that the 9/11 era was over. To some of us who follow the world news, that seems rather strange, given that AIIA is alive and kicking in Africa and spreading its wings down from Saharan Africa down into Nigeria and Cameroon. We don't think that's right. So without me pontificating about this, because I think most of you will know my views because they were expressed in our Global Cottages website last weekend, the question really is, are these documents worth the paper that they were printed on? And so tonight, to address the subject, hopefully with a little more refinement than I've posed it there, we have two really good people who have been very close to the action on Australian foreign affairs for recent years. First, on my extreme right, the national president of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, John McCarthy, who may be better known as one of our most illustrious ambassadors. And then with me closely here is an old friend of ours, Michael Wesley.
Let me start. So what a pleasure it is to be with Michael, who is one of those blokes, if you're sort of talking in the same room, you get slightly diffident after a while because he's extremely bright. And he, I think, did an enormously creditable job when he was at Lowy in the quality of the work that really enhanced the political debate in Australia, and I know he's doing the same thing at the ANU. Okay, I don't really, want to be another commentator on the white paper or on the national security speech, or to foreshadow what's going to happen in the defence white paper this year. And I'll give you a reason for that in a minute. The first point I'd like to make is this. Every now and again, we need to take a very hard, long look at our foreign policy. And we have to do it at the right time. I think the last time we really did it at the right time actually was with Gareth Evans, who did it in about 1990. And that was really at the end of the Cold War, when there were a whole host of new issues breaking out. And I think it was a very good, concise paper, which he orchestrated with his usual tough-mindedness. And while a lot of people in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade might have found it a pretty tough experience, it was a very good product. I don't think we've seen anything out of government like that since then. That's the first point I want to make. But it's time now to do it again. I mean, you could argue that certainly after 9/11 was probably time for a really good product, and I think you could have said it was time to look again at the world around about 2005, 2006, when the rise of China and India was extremely apparent, and when I think we could have worked through some new policies. I think we've got hold of the fact that the time is right now to have another look, and I think it's a good thing that we should do so. Now, my problem is that in the efforts to do that right now, we're doing it in a rather haphazard way. We're not bringing in the community as a whole, and we need to do this. There are three products, with those I mentioned. There's the national security document, the white paper, and there's the defence white paper, all of which will have been written by different people, all of which will have approached the issues from different angles, where although politically everybody will state that they're consistent, it will be quite clear that they don't take, even collectively, a holistic view of the direction in which Australia should go. The other point I'd make is that the white paper did consult widely within Australia. At least the engineers of the white paper consulted widely in Australia. They consulted a little bit overseas, not enough. But I think the overall product was so meddled with politically that it lost a lot of the good content that it had. And I think the really good content was the research that went into it, actually, which you can see, rather than the final product, because I think it really didn't deal with the difficult issues of what happens if things are different to the way we think they're going to happen. And that's crucial in a sort of paper like this. Now, my view is what we should do is really the following. And this is my personal view. It echoes my own prejudices. It's not necessarily something that everybody will agree with. Well, I think the first thing we have to do is a really hugely thorough appraisal of what is happening and what is likely to happen over the next 10 years in our foreign policy framework, if you like. Now, the best thing I've seen of this sort is a product that comes from the United States, and it's the National Security Estimate. Came out December last year, done every 4 years, tries to look 20 years ahead every 4 years. And it really is an amazing document. I'm sure Michael will agree. It's public. It's done by the National Intelligence Establishment in the United States in consultation with academics all over America and overseas. It's very frank. It's very frank about American deficiencies. It's very frank about what might happen around the world, including with America's allies. There is no way as yet we have produced a document of that sort. The problem being that we tend to be so cautious and in many cases so politicized that we have not got that capacity. Mind you, look, it's very difficult for any country to produce something like that to compare with the United States, because it is so amazing, that capacity for research, for debate, for thoroughness, and for going public, something which Australia is deficient on. Okay. Now, this particular estimate was very good. It saw 4 main global trends. And I won't go into it, you can get it on the internet, but it's essentially the emergence of the middle class and the empowerment of the individual. And that has a huge number of implications in terms of economic growth, in terms of what happens in particular societies, how particular societies will run. The second was demography, and demography is always crucial to any foreign policy assessment, absolutely crucial. Not only does it talk about China and India in this context, it talks about the growing importance of urbanization. In 1950, 30% of the world lived in cities. Now, about 50% live in cities. By 2030, 60+% will live in cities, with very, very major implications for the way international relations are conducted, as well as global economics. Also under demography, the importance of immigration, of global immigration. Third point they talk about, and this is where it really gets very interesting from a foreign policy perspective, is the diffusion of power. Not just what is happening with China and India, what is already established with Japan and the EU in terms of power, but using new measures of power, not just economics and not just military. They see a second 11 of countries coming up, which will be on the point of overtaking some of the economies, globally, the important economies, by 2030. And that second 11 comprises countries like Indonesia, Nigeria, Bangladesh, rather surprisingly, and so Iran, Mexico, and so on. And The other important point I think it makes here is that it doesn't see any one power being hegemonistic by 2030. And I think the other point that I found particularly interesting, despite the rise of China, despite all these issues, it pointed out that none of the changes that it saw taking place by 2030 would involve revisionist policies, which of course you saw in the confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, and you saw it in the Second World War. Both the antagonists to what you might call the democratic way had revisionist policies. You don't actually have that with the rise of China and the United States. It also talks about different centres of power, the rise of NGOs. There are 40,000 international NGOs in the world now. It is really totally different what it was, and it is something that will continue as a trend. And I think the final one was the nexus between food, water and energy. I think you can understand the dimensions of that. It then went on to what it talked about as the game changers against these major trends. And again, I won't rehearse these in any depth, but it was first of all global economy, the changes in the global economy, what it called the governance gap, an issue of importance in countries like China and the Gulf in particular, where the development of those countries was going at a much greater pace than the governance to keep up with that development. Talked about conflict potential around the world, then regional instability, and there it was really very important in terms of Australia's interests in our immediate region. New technologies, the importance of that goes without saying, and a good chunk on the power of the US. It then went on to different worst and best case scenarios, but it really gave an excellent framework for examining the way the world is going to work over the next 10 to 20 years, what the main elements were. Now, I'm not suggesting that Australia do the same thing as the US, but a framework of that sort, which really involves a huge amount of detailed, tough work, looking at alternative scenarios, not just working on the assumption everything is going to continue as we see it now, but seeing what can intervene over the next 10 or 15 years. It was really excellent work in that respect. So that's the first thing. The second thing we have to do in conjunction with that first appraisal is to look at our policies and our policy imperatives. And I don't want to get into detail here because I can't. I don't know what they're going to be. But looking personally, I would see them as follows. The policy imperatives in our NAIR region, that's the Pacific and Papua New Guinea, clearly. Secondly, I think here, and this is really crucial, we will be looking at a different type of Indonesia over the next 20 years. We've been used to looking at Indonesia as a problem neighbour, and by heavens the Indonesians look at us as the problem neighbour. But we are a country of 22 million, highly developed. They're a developing country of 250 million. In 20 years' time, there is the potential for them to be the 6th biggest economy in the world. In certain sectors, highly developed. The overall they'll be a much bigger economy than we are. The overall relation between Australia and Indonesia has to reflect that. And that is going to be a huge challenge, particularly as there are a number of intervening factors that could well come into the growth of India over the next 15 or 20 years. The type of leadership it has being one, for example. So that's the first area to look at. The second thing I think we have to look at is how we deal with the changes in the region as a whole, with what you might call the sort of multipolar development of the region. And that is to say the competing strengths of China, India, Japan, Indonesia, and of course the United States. The role that we need to take. Now again, I don't want to go into this in detail, but obviously the relationship with the United States is going to remain key to us. But we should, I believe, develop that relationship and maintain that relationship on the basis of our interests as we see them, and not necessarily American interests as they see them. I put it as simply as that. And that doesn't involve disloyalty, it involves hard-headedness and a realistic assessment of where our interests lie. I don't, by the way, see us moving away from the alliance, but I should stress that the alliance is an alliance, and alliance allows each country to have different interests. And it doesn't mean to say that we have to walk in lockstep with an ally. That's not what alliances are about. But we also, of course, then have to understand how our relationships should develop with the rest of Asia and what we want from the rest of Asia. I would say that I'm not a great one for inventing academic catchphrases, but a sort of benevolent multipolarity, I think, would be what I would see as desirable for the region. Multipolarity in its classic sense can involve a capacity to clash, and obviously that we want to prevent. But I don't see a structure where everybody sort of accepts a new order nicely as being feasible. Anyway, that can be developed later if need be. I think the third point really is we can't dismiss our global role. I think there's been a tendency too much for Australia to say, oh, well, we concentrate on the region, we have almost no missions in Africa, Latin America, we cut them down to about 2 for every major city in Europe, 2 people, 3 people, except London, maybe Paris, maybe Berlin. The rest is sort of tiny. I think we've been negligent for 30 years. Of course we concentrate on the region, but if we talk about being a middle power, we talk about global responsibilities, we want to be able to take advantage through our interests of global change, bearing in mind this second 11 that is coming up, bearing in mind our interests in the G20. We can't just concentrate on the region, and we can't just ignore the UN as a sort of luxury. It's the only game in town which everybody attends. And I think, again, although we've had spurts of interest over the years, I'm not a UN practitioner, I think it's crazy to just be dismissive of it, as has been the want of governments from time to time in this country. So all those 3 things have to be reflected in the way we develop our policy. The third point I'd like to make about the development of Australian policy is the degree to which we work in silos in Australia. And there are 2 lots of silos. There are silos within Canberra where really other departments, 3 different groups were involved in, actually far more, in doing these papers that we talk about. But often, the defence go off on their own and do something, foreign affairs and trade, I don't think really understand fully that their role has to be one of reasserting its right to cover policy as a whole, not just deal with sort of niche areas such as human rights and issues which, and relations between countries in a general way, but issues which other departments regard as important. You see this in an embassy where you have to deal with not only the sort of traditional foreign affairs work of all of the dealings between countries in a sort of traditional way, but you have to deal with agriculture, you have to deal with defence issues, you have to deal with climate change, you have to deal with consular problems. You see it all in the post. In Canberra, you kind of get lost, and every department tends to go off and do its own thing, and that's crazy because it's all external policy. The other silo problem we have in Australia is Canberra. There are a few countries where, possibly Brazil, where the capital is so isolated from the rest of the community. And you realise that when you come and live in a city like Sydney. Policy is made in Canberra. They don't actually consult a huge amount with the capitals, either with the states, which in our community are important, or with other elements of the community to the degree that happens in other comparable countries. It really is an issue here, and I think the community as a whole don't understand how Canberra works, in particular the foreign policy area works, and Canberra, I don't think, understands how the rest of the world works. We now have 4th generation public servants at Canberra, and that tells you a lot, about the way it regards the rest of the community. So I really, having lived there for 40 years, I've never realised it's like that in a city, at least not to the same extent. So in any policy development, you really have to bring in the rest of the country in a very serious way. You have to do that. Now, if I were to, and you have to make it public. There's no point in keeping these things secret. The issues are so important, they have to be public. Even if you offend people, even if you say politically embarrassing things, you've got to get real about this. Now, what I would do, if I were king, would be to say something like this. When we've had a new election, it is time then, really, for whatever the new government is, to really set about a policy in which it brings in the states. A policy to deal not only with the region but globally, where we make an assessment of what our interests are overseas, what the changes are going to be, and then what the policy should be. And it needs to be done holistically. You can't have one paper on this by one group of people, another paper by another group of people. It really needs to be looked at. And my sense is that it may just be better to put this off to a group of private individuals rather than to leave it to the government. Because I'm kind of nervous about the capacity of the government to be open in Australia. I just don't think we're good at it. And secondly, I have a nervousness about everything being politicised. Not a bad idea. I mean, would be to give it to the ANU. They could, they're a pretty bright crowd on the whole, and they've got a few good people.
Despite being in Canberra.
They have an absolute tyrant of a chancellor who would make sure they did the work. And they would be in a very good capacity, have a very good capacity to consult the rest of the community. But I really do think, however it's done, it's got to be done in a very cogent way, which involves assessment in a serious way, looking at all the possible ways that things can go wrong. And it needs a really thoughtful look at policy for the next 10 years. It needs to consult the public, it needs to bring them in, it needs to consult intelligent, good people overseas. And if we look at those issues holistically, we may come up with something. Now, that's very idealistic. I would have the horrors if I tried to drive that through Canberra. I mean, I think it would be a terrible task. But it could be done. I think it should be done. I think the issues are so important. Something like that has to be done. But we do have to move away from our health career. Okay.
I'm not quite sure what to say now. Apart from the fact that John's totally wrong about Canberra. Everything else he said is absolutely right. Thank you for the invitation, Colin. It's a great pleasure to be here with someone as distinguished as John McCarthy. And in fact, I think if I could make one cogent piece of policy advice about Australian foreign policy in the next 10 years, it's that the government should, by fiat, reverse John McCarthy's retirement from our diplomatic service. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Asian century. We're finally here. We've waited for it for so long and we're finally here. It really does make you think, though, about what it is that we actually mean by the Asian century. And I'm not quite sure whoever thought up that term quite understands what it means. I think one of the origins of the term comes from an essay written by Henry Luce, the guy who founded Time magazine, when he wrote an essay called The American Century that was published in the magazine Life on the 17th of February 1941. And what Henry Luce said was that the American century must be a century, the 20th century, in which America is not only dominant in terms of production and military power and culture and consumption, but that America starts to shape the world according to American values. So if that's what a certain named century means, it means that the Asian century means something more than what the white paper says it is. According to the white paper, the Asian century simply means that the centre of production and consumption and all of this other stuff has simply moved to Asia. And I think we need to be a little bit more exacting than that. If you think about it in those terms, Australia, if it is entering the Asian century, if Australia's third century after European colonisation is the Asian century, the first might be called the British century, the second might be called the American century, and the third might be called the Asian century. But I'm not so sure that I'm ready to concede to the government that the Asian century will be quite as benign as what the white paper suggests. I mean, if you read the white paper, and I don't really recommend it, but if you do read the white paper, it suggests that the Asian century will be the best of the three for us. That really it will be a continuation of the benign conditions that we found ourselves under the British century, that got even better under the American century, and then we'll be even better off under the Asian century. In fact, it even gives an increment in our per capita wealth that we can expect from the Asian century. I think this is fundamentally strategically naive, deeply strategically naive. Now, I don't want to go on about the white paper because it's a bit like kicking a lame dog. I haven't really heard anyone who's been willing to defend it. But what I want to talk to you a little bit about tonight is that I think I've got one fear and one hope about this Asian century. My fear is that the rise of a multipolar order in Asia that John was talking about, which I agree is happening, is going to start to erode the one key international condition that Australia has always relied on, given where it is, given what it produces, given our size, both in terms of our physical geography and our demography, which are two very different sizes, and that is a peaceful global commons. Now, what do I mean by global commons? The term commons comes from early modern Europe, and it was a piece of grass that nobody owned, but that everyone was allowed to graze their sheep and their cattle on. And basically, a commons was something that no one could fence off, but everyone could benefit from it. And if you think about it, the command of the seas, or the free and open shipping lanes in our part of the world, in fact in all parts of the world, have since European colonisation of Australia been very calm, very reasonably uncontested. And that's mainly because there have been two countries that have been in command of those commons since we were founded in 1788. First Britain and then the United States. Both of those countries come from English common law traditions, and both of them fundamentally understand how important to the common good a free and uncontested commons is. So my fear, ladies and gentlemen, is that in this era of power shift and power contestation in our region, we are seeing, and I think we're already partly seeing this now, the loss of the United States of command over the commons. So the sea lanes that our commerce depends on so fundamentally, the command of sea and air space that we depend on to communicate with and trade with for the rest of the world, I think is starting to be fundamentally undermined and contested. Now, the first order contender of the American command of the global maritime commons is China. China is fundamentally uncomfortable with the fact that the US Navy has been able to sail up and down the Chinese coastline at will. That includes during times when China and the United States don't see eye to eye, such as during the 1996 Taiwan Straits crisis, but also when China and the United States tend to be getting on fairly well. You have to remember that a vast proportion of China's population, its productive capacity, exists along its eastern seaboard. And so to have the US Navy sailing at will up and down that seaboard is profoundly unsettling for the Chinese. And so the Chinese, of course, have been developing weapon systems, missiles, submarines and so on and so forth, that are starting to make the Americans very uncomfortable about their ability to sail up and down these coastlines without seriously losing an aircraft carrier or two or three. And remember, there is a lot of prestige and power invested in an aircraft carrier. When the Japanese lost 6 aircraft carrier groups in the Battle of Midway in 1942, that was the end of the war for them. They continued to fight for 3 years, but that was the end of the war. So the Americans know how dangerous it is for the Chinese to begin to contest these sea lanes. It's not only the Chinese. India has decided that it is going to be a maritime great power. It has started to invest in exactly the same things, the aircraft carriers, the submarines, and so on and so forth. It wants to control the sea lanes or at least contest the sea lanes in the Indian Ocean. And what that brings us to is a situation in which no one power can control the sea lanes and that a whole range of different powers can contest them. It's a very dangerous situation for us in Australia, and quite frankly, I'm not sure of the governance arrangements that work out around a contested set of sea lanes. We haven't seen one of those or a set of relations like that for centuries. And how we do it in this age of nuclear missiles and surface-to-sea missiles and so on is something that we're really not sure about. So that's my fear. My wife keeps telling me that I'm unduly pessimistic, so here's my hope. Here's my hope. One of the things that is occurring, I think, in the Asian century is that a very old, what I call power and trade highway is starting to be re-engendered and redeveloped. In the era before 1492, when Vasco da Gama decided to turn up in the Indian Ocean, there is a very old trade route that stretched from the Arabian or Persian Gulf, around the coasts of India, through the Malacca Straits, through Southeast Asia, and all the way up to China, Japan, and Korea. It was one of the most intense trade routes on Earth. It was called the Maritime Silk Road, and it was facilitated by very regular monsoon winds. What happened to break that up was a couple of things. The Portuguese arrived and tried to establish control of the spice routes. The Dutch tried to take it off the Portuguese, and then the British arrived and took it off everyone and turned the Indian Ocean into a British lake. Now, then that was displaced by trade and conflict across the North Pacific and North Atlantic. But now we're starting to see, particularly with the energy thirst of China, Japan, Korea, and the East Asian states, the re-establishment of that trade route. But instead of taking spices, and instead of taking silks and pottery and so on, it's taking energy. And it's increasingly taking other commodities, manufactures from East Asia into the Middle East. It's starting to see investment stretch across Asia, starting to see infrastructure stretch across Asia. So we are actually entering in what has become a vogue term in Canberra now, an Indo-Pacific age. What the Indo-Pacific age means for Australia is that the centre of power and contestation in the world has suddenly come much closer to our coastlines. So what Geoffrey Blaney talked about as a tyranny of distance has actually started to become a tyranny of proximity for us. We can no longer decide when to become involved and how much to care about the world. The world is starting to insist on us caring about it. Now, the hope that I've got is that this will change Australia's mindset and its view on the world. Because if you think about that Indo-Pacific trade route and you picture it in your mind, it's cut in half by a peninsula of land and islands that stretch down that we conventionally think of as Southeast Asia, which term derives from a British military term of the Second World War. That's how recent it is. I think we should be calling it the Indo-Pacific Peninsula. And if you think about it that way, you'll see that Australia is not separate from Southeast Asia. It's not separate from the Indo-Pacific Peninsula. It is part of the Indo-Pacific Peninsula. It's a big bulbous piece of land at the end of the Indo-Pacific Peninsula, and that means we need to start to think strategically in these terms. We need to completely rethink our global map of what parts of the world are significant to us and what parts of the world we need to engage with intellectually and diplomatically most intensively. And of course, my argument here is that it's the other parts of the Indo-Pacific Peninsula that start to become of enormous importance to us. I agree absolutely with John, but I would add some of the other countries of that part of the world. I would add Singapore, Malaysia, the Philippines. I would add Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Burma to that part of the world. It is time for Australia to start to think of itself as an Indo-Pacific peninsular country and start to think about what that means, particularly in an era when command of the global commons is starting to be seriously contested. First of all, the pivot, I think, is very long on rhetoric and very short on reality. Sounds like something a bit close to home, but two things about the pivot. Firstly, the United States, if it implies a build-up of power in the Asia-Pacific, the United States needs to stop cutting its military spending. The other thing it needs to do is start to draw some military resources, diplomatic resources out of the Middle East, to which my response is, good luck with that. I don't see the Middle East anytime soon about to become terribly benign so that the United States can draw resources away from it. Do I think the United States will continue to be a major player in the world? Yes. The United States, apart from anything else, continues to be the only country in the world that sees itself as having a genuinely global role, and it will not resile from that anytime soon. It may be less and less able to play that decisive role, but it will be the only player that will see itself as playing that role. Europe, I think Europe will continue to be in a difficult position for a long time. And the interesting thing about Europe, as opposed to countries in this part of the world, was said to me by a senator as part of a delegation of visiting French parliamentarians that visited us while I was at the Lowy Institute. We'd had a long talk about what was happening in this part of the world, and he said, you know, in this part of the world, all anyone can think about is the rise of China. In our part of the world, all anyone can think about is the rise of Islam. So I think it's a worldview difference.
Look, I couldn't agree more with Michael on the issue of the United States worldview. The one thing about living in Washington that you realise is they are a global power and they have a global perspective, which is very different to Australia, which essentially has a regional perspective. And different to most countries, actually. They have a global perspective and they have to think of their priorities, what they have to do in the whole of the world. They have an enormous stake in the Middle East because of security reasons, because of domestic political reasons, but also, of course, hugely for economic reasons. Now, I think the only point I'd make about the United States and the Middle East, which is a long-term point, is that in 10 to 15 years they may well be self-sufficient in fuel because of shale oil and gas. Now, that's not straightforward for a whole lot of legal and environmental reasons, but it's certainly a trend. And that may mean that they have less of a direct interest in the Middle East than they have right now. That said, they will continue to have a major interest in the Middle East for security reasons and because a number of the countries with which they are close will be dependent on Gulf fuel, and the health of the world economy will be dependent on Gulf fuel. So it will remain important, but not in the same way. The second point, though, is the European issue. I think I really don't know a lot about what Obama's immediate policies in Europe are. I just reading that in the last few weeks. What I do know, though, is there is concern in the United States about how the Trans-Pacific Partnership is going, because that has been the big ambition of this administration has been to develop the TPP to benefit the United States and its relations with economic relations with Asia. And as you know, not all Asian countries are possible signatories to the TPP, but are fairly significant, including China is. One of the questions is whether Japan might get into it or not, and that is being discussed about now between Abe and President Obama. I would see the United States as still having a major economic interest in Asia, but there are concerns about the TPP. Bear in mind, before one moves away from their interests in Asia, look at the trade figures between the United States and China, the United States and Japan. They are, huge, and I think is right. China is the biggest United States trading partner right now. Very significant dealings in India. All those issues mean to me that it's going to be a long time before the United States retreats from the Asia-Pacific. In fact, I don't think it's its intention to do so at all. I think it's a positive development that some of the rhetoric has declined in the last 12 months or so, away from the pivot down to rebalancing, and you're not hearing quite as much of that as you did, because it certainly did align the Chinese, I think probably unnecessarily.
Thanks, Rawdon. A couple of points about the Chinese motivations, and Jamie Riley would know much more about this than I do, but a couple of things. Firstly, I do think my former colleague Lindy Jacobson at the Lowy Institute has made a very important point, and that is that one of the developments in China over the last 20 years or so is that there has been an incredible proliferation of powerful foreign policy actors in China, to the extent where if you wanted to find out what's going on in Chinese foreign policy, the last place you'd go in Beijing was the foreign ministry. You'd go to a range of about 14 other places first. So that's the first thing. I think there are powerful agencies within China that have a real bureaucratic interest in keeping tension around China's maritime borders up. The other thing I would say is that China is at a really quite uncomfortable place at the moment in terms of its foreign relations. The global financial crisis thrust China to the forefront of the global power ranking system probably much quicker than China was actually comfortable with. Everyone still looks to China and the Chinese economy as the great salvation of the world economy. And I think there are people within China who say, well, if we're so important, if we're so prominent in the world, why don't countries that are smaller than us respect our wishes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea? And so I think there's a real disjunction there in the minds of some Chinese policymakers about being given respect on one hand, but not being accorded respect when China starts to stand up for what it sees are its rights.
Look, the specifics of the disagreements are historical. They have to do with claims, in some cases going back to the end of the last century, and they are also coloured by nationalist sentiments in, I suppose, the four major countries involved, which were China, Japan, Philippines, and Vietnam, but also because of, they're important because of sea routes and because of oil and gas potential in the areas of question. Let's not get into whose fault it is, because that gets tossed around. I think the Chinese attitude is manifested because of a number of factors. Some of these have been alluded to by Michael, but I'd say there was 3 or 4 things. First of all, nationalism in China, a potent force with which the government has to deal. Sometimes it stokes it up, sometimes it has to push it down. By the fact that the Red Army is probably, the PLA, what am I using those expressions for? The PLA is a lot more powerful on some of these issues than many in China would want, as well as many outside would want. And I think with the leadership transition, the leadership is finding its feet, and they also have to deal with a whole host of domestic political issues, which means that they may not be focusing on these questions all the time. The Japanese side, very strong nationalist sentiment, particularly under Abe, but it's been growing in the last 3 years, because of concerns about China. But it has been an element in the Japanese polity since the Second World War. It's by no means the only element. There is a strongly pacifist streak in Japan, and indeed one party in the coalition government is essentially got a Buddhist background and has a strongly pacifist inclination. But there is a strong right-wing element, several right-wing elements in Japan which are fiercely nationalist, and they drive these policies to a considerable degree. Hence, no real apology, although you could dispute the wording on that, the visits to the Yasukuni Shrine and so on. But there is a strong nationalist streak. Also, bear in mind, Vietnam has had many differences with China, the Philippines has had many differences with China, but more Vietnam. I would, by the way, see this as being a more serious issue in relation to the East China Sea than the South China Sea. Sweeping statement, but I think it's right because of the American alliance with Japan, and I think for the tendency to go things wrong, for things to go wrong. I think feelings are stronger on either side in the East China Sea than the South China Sea. What should Australia do? Not a lot. I think there is one area. There has been some discussion about various formulae, basically to help settle the South China Sea dispute. They include, for example, using some of the, if you like, intellectual property involved in Antarctic mechanisms in the South China Sea. There may be something to that, but the best that Australia can do, if it wants to help, would be to help with that sort of thing, but decide not to take the credit. We're not very good at that, but that's the sort of thing we can do, but we don't want to sort of stride on the stage on this one. Look, there are some excellent public servants in Canberra, and some very good work has been done. What I'm saying is that a holistic, forward-looking policy document on what our external policy should be, I haven't seen it since that Gareth Evans paper. There have been individual papers that would have been quite good pieces of work, but what I'm saying is something we can really say, this is the direction that this country should go, taking into account public opinion and taking into account as many of the imponderables as possible. I don't think we're at that. And I think if we were at it, it would probably be very highly classified. I think that's a mistake. It really does need a public area. Have the bureaucrats and politicians not been as conscientious as they might have? I think the bureaucrats really try within the terms of reference they're given, and I think it's not bad. I think politically, with the exception of the paper to which I alluded, there's a little bit of the sort of ticking the box with some politicians. They get something which is an announceable and get it out and then move on to the next issue. I don't, by the way, think that was the case with the last Defence White Paper, because Mr. Rudd got into that in a big way. I'm not sure that the product was ideal, but I think it contradicts the point I made earlier about politicians not following these things. They do. But if you look at the White Paper, I found that, again, I think there's some very good research work in it. But I found what was disappointing was this piece of paper was put out. It was really then made into a sort of political vehicle. 80 different ministers put out press releases about it. and everything was wrapped into it. It was a sort of Uncle Tom Cogley and all document, where you brought in things like the Murray-Darling scheme into it, and it just, I think that was bad.